So what is it when we're talking about strategy? The textbook defines it as the textbook defines it as this analysis, decisions, and actions is how it groups it. And the textbook gives a great discussion of that. You're going to find in these videos, I try not to discuss what I think that the textbook does a great job of discussing. Rather, I try to either argue with it or bring in additional perspectives. Um, and that's why I had you read that additional reading by Michael Porter, whose article is entitled "What is Strategy." Now, Michael Porter is one of the most famous guys in strategic management, but I have to tell you that article was very controversial when he published it. A lot of people disagreed with it. In fact, you're going to find there are going to be times where we're going to argue a little bit with that article. But the main thing I wanted you to get from that article was this definition of strategy as position, trade-off, fit. What I find is that is a very useful way to think of strategy, and you're going to see me use that definition a lot. Position is, how do we appeal to our customers? In other words, what do people think we are? What position in the marketplace are we trying to occupy? Trade-off is Michael Porter's big thing, which is you can't be everything to everybody. And then fit is how you take that position and your value chain and you make it all work together. Now, he has this very detailed definition of fit that I'm not going to ask you to focus on too much. What I want you to see, though, is it's possible for companies to have misfit, which is detrimental to their performance. For example, as I make these videos, McDonald's is in the midst of a bit of an identity crisis and a turnaround. Let's imagine, for example, that McDonald's says our problem is customers don't trust our food, so we're going to go with 100% grass-fed beef in our hamburgers. I would argue that's probably misfit because what is McDonald's? McDonald's is fast, inexpensive food. Is there anything inexpensive about grass-fed beef? Not really. So that would potentially be misfit, where you've got a position which says we're basically trying to be cheap, fast food, and then we put something in our value chain which is sure to really drive up our cost. Now, another company that deals with this idea of trade-off and fit and does it beautifully, and I'm going to reference them a couple of times in this chapter, is Amazon. What is Amazon's position? I didn't say their strategy, but what is their position? Their position is basically the go-to online retailer. In other words, they want you to be the first place to shop on the web when you're looking for some sort of a consumer product. So what's the trade-off involved in that? Well, there's that big duh. Where aren't they selling their products? Now, they have in fact opened a very few bricks and mortar stores, but not many, and only in very big, very big cities, more as test cases. So one of the trade-offs that Amazon's made is we're not going to be a bricks and mortar retailer. And then how do they get fit in their value chain? And this is one of the things I love that shows how you can get that complementary fit, even though sometimes the pieces are counterintuitive. If Amazon's going to be the first place you look for something, they have to have a very broad product offering, more broad than they probably can effectively manage. So Amazon made the very counterintuitive and yet brilliant decision many years ago that they were going to commit heresy. They were going to invite other companies to put their stuff on the web with Amazon, so that really all Amazon is a matchmaker who takes a small percentage of the cut. So they're actually putting competitors, and there are times where you can see you can buy it on Amazon, but there are also other places to buy it off of Amazon. And Amazon says, hey, we take a cut from all of those deals. So by making that very counterintuitive decision of we're actually going to let competitors use our website to market their wares, they actually got overall achieved fit, which is we want Amazon to be the first place people come, and we profit from all those exchanges, some more so than others. When we talk about the strategy process, there's going to be a temptation to view it as a very clean and neat process. We start with our vision, we do our analysis, decisions, we take actions, we assess performance. It's not really like that. This is more of how it appears. One thing that our textbook does an excellent job of describing that most textbooks don't is this idea of, hey, strategies change. And so we set out on our journey from this point, and we're trying to move towards our strategy, but things happen, opportunities emerge, whatever, and we end up with a very different strategy as our realized strategy. So how do we deal with that, or to what do we attribute that? What does it mean when a company changes its strategy? it may mean that the world has changed and they had to adapt. A couple of years ago, we had a guest speaker from Dell who talked about the major change in the computer market, and that was in the 1990s and early 2000s. People were very informed of the individual components. I want an Intel chip, blah, 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 blah. I want this type of RAM. I want this much RAM. I want this type of video graphics card. And what happened was, through the competition, all those parts became so similar. And now people were not asking to customize their computer as much, which was the brilliance of Dell that allowed people to customize their computer and get it quickly. And so that sales channel kind of dried up. And now suddenly people were more willing to go to Best Buy and Walmart and buy things off the shelf because they weren't that particular about the internal components because there had been such a melding. And that really was what undid Dell. That was a key component of its strategy that got yanked out from underneath of them. And they're still trying to adapt to that. Sometimes, though, you have to change because you've blown it. An example of a company that's been in a turnaround for a long time is JCPenney, and they hired a brilliant new CEO, Ron Johnson, who had been the director of retail at Apple and a superstar at Target. And he came in and introduced all kinds of new merchandising changes and retailing strategy changes that just absolutely tanked their revenue. And so they fired Johnson and basically said, we're going to go back to our old failed strategy, although they really did keep more of Johnson's strategy than they want to admit, because some of the things he was doing was working a lot better than people thought it was. But they kind of went back to their old strategy and said, we're just not going to lose so fast. So then you get the question of, when is changing strategy too much? Is it possible to change strategy too much? I mean, are we not a nimble, agile company? This is where I think Porter's framework is so informative. Position, trade-off, fit. A company that's constantly changing strategy stands the real probability of confusing the customer as to what their position is. I don't know who they are. I don't know why they're really different than everybody else. Therefore, I don't know why I should use them instead of one of their competitors. So A, you confuse the position. B, by constantly changing the trade-offs that typically go with position changes, then C, you're not able to enforce fit. You're not able to make those very wise trade-offs and then get your value chain really working for you. And so because of that, you're constantly running around with higher costs and lower value than all of your competitors are offering. In the next video, I'm going to introduce this slide, and we're going to talk about some fundamental ways that people tend to approach this question of why do some firms outperform others. Come back in a minute.